Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. Today's webinar will be about creating dynamic visuals for comics with Clip Studio Paint, presented by Jaki. Before we begin the webinar, there are some housekeeping items I would like to go through. The webinar will be approximately 1 hour long. All attendees will be muted. There will be a Q&A sessions in the last 15 minutes of the webinar, so please use the question panel to send your questions. There's a chat, but we usually use it only for information. So any comment, doubt, or question to Jaki, use the question panel. Due to time constraints, fortunately, not all the questions will be answered. And also, this webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be shared on social media and will be sent via email to all registrants and attendees. The panelists for this webinar are Mario Quiñones, myself, and Jaki King. For those of you who connect with us for the very first time or have never heard about Clip Studio Paint, Clip Studio Paint is your all-in-one solution for stunning, ready-to-publish illustrations, comics, manga, and animations. Learn more at clipstudio.net/n and graphicsly.com. Also, we invite you to share your Instagram stories, tagging us as #webinar, at HeyIt'sJaki, at Graphicsly, at Wacom, and at Clip Studio Official. We'll be sharing your stories if you tag us. Jaki King is a freelance illustrator and designer and a Bostonian transplant in Vancouver. She is the creator of the webcomics Ladykillers, Webtoon Canvas, and KISMET, Hiveworks, and has previously worked as an art assistant on Lore Olympus. And so with that, I will leave you with Jaki and her presentation, Creating Dynamic Visuals for Comics with Clip Studio Paint. Thank you so much.
All righty. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Mario. Hi, everybody. As the title suggests, I'm so sorry. There seems to be an issue here. As the title suggests, sorry, one moment. There we go. So sorry about those technical difficulties. All right. As the title suggests, today we're going to be talking about creating dynamic visuals for comics. I've split this talk into 3 sections. Part 1 is on composition for comics. Part 2 is on visual storytelling through the principle of show, don't tell. And part 3 is going to be a live demonstration of how I thumbnail a comic page. Okay, we've got a lot of material to cover today, so let's jump right in. To start, let me ask you a rhetorical question. What is the most important part of making an enjoyable comic? You might think that it's having beautiful dynamic visuals, but the answer is actually much simpler. It has to be easily read and understood. It doesn't matter if a comic has beautiful art or a meaningful story if the reader can't make sense of what's happening on the page. The quality of the art, the story, and the humor, those things are all subject to individual tastes and preferences, but understanding is universal. So, how do you ensure that your comic is easy to understand? You do that with the power of composition. So there are entire university level classes on composition, and unfortunately, we don't have that kind of time. So we're just going to speed run this concept and go over a few fundamentals that I find useful in my own comic production workflow. The hope is that with these tools, we can create comics that readers can follow intuitively without getting confused or lost, and that uses the elements on each page to naturally direct the viewer's attention to the most important parts. So, with that said, let's get into it. What is composition? Merriam-Webster defines composition as the act or process of composing specifically arrangement into specific proportion or relation, and especially into artistic form. This is a word salad. The Tate Gallery puts it in much simpler terms. It defines composition as the arrangement of elements within a work of art. So to put this into practice, let's start by defining good composition. Good is obviously subjective, but where comics are concerned, I believe that good composition clearly conveys what is happening at a glance. So let's take this example from one of my favorite comics, Calvin and Hobbes. It is easy to parse, and the visuals make good use of the space provided while also guiding the reader's eye along the page. I'll give you a second to drink this in. Now, to contrast, let's ask the question, what makes for bad composition? Bad composition is muddled, confusing, and difficult to parse. It'll make a comic hard to read and hard to follow. But what does that mean exactly? Behold, this page of nightmares. This is like the visual equivalent of Merriam-Webster's definition for composition. It is dense and it's confusing. Now, I've cobbled this page together using sequential panels for my own comic, Ladykillers, which I cut up and pasted into this utterly incomprehensible layout. Forget conveying what's going on. Can you even figure out the right ordering in which to read the panels on this page? I'll spare you the headache of actually spending the time to figure that out, and I'll just show you the answer. So I went out of my way here to create something deliberately awful, but hopefully this helps paint a picture for you of what bad composition looks like. The components of each panel don't make good use of the space available. You'll notice many of the big panels have lots of empty space, whereas some of the smaller panels have a ton crammed into them, and they're also not laid out in a sensible way. Even more than that, the panels and the contents of the panels don't really help to guide your eye across the page, making this whole thing a jumbled and confusing mess. So now we've established what works and what doesn't, let's move on to making composition work for us in our comics. Here are some basic concepts we can use to control the composition of a page. You might already be familiar with these if you've taken an art class, so bear with me. The idea is we want to use these basic tools to emphasize important panels and objects so that we can direct the viewer's eye across the page. And we'll do that by creating contrast. So we're going to be going over each of these topics by first defining them and then looking at an example. So let's dive in with the first concept on the list, color. In case you don't know what color is, color refers to a specific hue of an element on the page. We can see here how color is being employed to great effect. By using the complementary colors of red and green, it really helps to center the reader's attention on the shattering green car in the middle of this panel. And by contrast, the word crash is done in orange, which keeps that sound effect less prominent than the punchy action happening in the foreground. Moving along to the next concept, value refers to how light or dark something is on a scale of white to black. Here we can see how value is being used to create distinct silhouettes. Notice how the figures are easily identifiable, with Meryl being depicted in lighter values and Snake being shadowed in darker values. And you'll notice that these shapes are clear without the use of any liner. In fact, you might even notice that there aren't any lines defining the boundaries between each panel. Now that is making values work for you. So, moving on to the exact opposite, shape defines an object in space, usually through the use of lines, which were so noticeably absent in our last example. Now, in this example, it's probably pretty obvious how shape is being utilized here. The distinct lines help define every element on the page without the use of any color or even midtones. And you can also see how the use of liner really allows the artist here to add a ton of detail. Moving on to some comics-specific compositional tools, let's talk about panels and paneling. In comics, the shape and position of the panels on the page can be used to direct the viewer's eye. I'm assuming most people here are interested in making comics for a Western audience, so we're going to operate under the assumption that we're reading from left to right. Now, we can see here how the panels on this page are directing the reader's eye from left to right. By grouping a bunch of smaller panels in the bottom left and in the upper right, we can see how the reader's eye is naturally pulled across the page from the big dramatic panels in the upper left to the bigger panel on the bottom right. And the last thing in the compositional toolbox we'll be covering today are speech bubbles. These are an easy way to direct the reader's eye, as they provide a natural focal point for the reader's eye to rest on and follow as they work their way across a page. We can see here how the speech bubbles are positioned in a way that it pulls the reader's gaze across all the panels on the page as the reader sequentially reads each bit of dialogue between these two characters. Now, that was a lot of material we just covered, so let's try and put all these principles into practice by looking at a single comic page and seeing how it employs these tools to make reading it feel easy and intuitive. Here's a page from the comic Heart of Gold. I'll give you a minute to look it over and see what compositional techniques it employs to help make reading it easy for the viewer. I will also take a sip of water while you do that. All right, so for me, the first thing I notice about this page is its striking color palette. Notice how the color red really stands out against the blues that make up the rest of the page, and how the red is being strategically placed to draw your eye across the page. Now, I've turned down the saturation on the page to better showcase how it's using values to create contrast between the lighter panels up top and the darker panels on the bottom of the page. We can also see how most of the emphasis is being placed on the two panels in the center, with the totally black background making these panels the hardest hitting things on the page. Now, this particular style isn't as heavy on line art, but we can still see how line art is being employed here to create more contrast and add further detail to the figures on the page. So in the first panel up top, we can see how the darker line art emphasizes the character in the foreground. And in this fourth panel, we can see how line art is being used to add more detail to this character's hands. And when we zoom back out to a more holistic view of the page, we can see that the layout of the panels themselves helps to pull the reader's eye across the page. And finally, we can even see how the speech bubbles are being employed to guide the reader to the right side of the page. And after that, the composition of the rest of the panels does the rest, since there aren't any more speech bubbles for the reader to follow. So that's how we can use the composition of a comic page to enhance its readability. Again, there are entire semester-long courses you can take on composition, so we're really only scratching the surface here, but I hope this gives you a simple set of tools you can work with to make your comics easy to understand and follow. Now, before we move on to part 2, I want to pose this rhetorical question to you. Which of these panels is more engaging or dynamic? I really hope you said panel B. Comics as a medium allows us to tell a story using visuals. And as the saying goes, a picture tells 1,000 words, so you should let your picture do the talking for you. Long expositional word dumps can really disrupt the flow of a scene and slow things down. Now, of course, there's a balance to be struck between having gigantic, boring info dumps and having too little exposition and then leaving your readers in the dark. But having a visual medium gives us a lot of room to let the art do the talking for us and let the power of implication do the heavy lifting. And then your readers can figure things out for themselves, which is to say, show and don't tell. So, welcome to part 2 of this talk, where I'm going to go over some basic techniques on how to use the visuals in your comic to show the reader what you mean without dumping a ton of text on the page. We'll also build on what we've learned about composition to keep our comic pages easy to read and follow. Here are some tools we can use to create impactful, intentional visuals in our comics that help us to show without telling. My intention today isn't necessarily to teach you how to do these things, but instead provide you with some examples of how you can implement them in your own workflow to reduce the amount of exposition you need to do. So with that said, let's get right into it. So we'll start with a big picture, paneling. The general rule for paneling is as follows. Big panels represent longer moments of time, or beats, and smaller panels represent shorter moments of time. Think of each panel as a continuous shot from a camera in a movie. You want the camera to linger on establishing shots that set the scene, or you want it to linger on specific moments that you want your viewer to focus on. By contrast, when showcasing action or a montage of activities, you want the camera to cut quickly from beat to beat. We can see this principle in action here, where the tall panel on the left represents a longer beat, and the smaller panels on the right are cutting back and forth between the two characters and a slice of pizza as they interact. We can also see how the composition of these panels naturally draws the reader's eye across the page. Now, these panels are pretty regularly shaped. They're all rectangular and evenly spaced, but don't be afraid to experiment with panel shapes and sizes or the lack thereof. Full page spreads can be used really effectively to show continuous action or a detailed view of the scene. We can see that being employed here, where the action continues as the viewer's eye is drawn down the staircase. And in this two-page spread, we can see how the establishing shot in the upper half of the spread works like a camera panning across the bar, and the panels in the lower half cut quickly back and forth between the characters present as they talk. Finally, we can see some other irregular panel shapes being employed here to do a great job of showcasing rapid-fire action. The way the panels are angled create a sense of movement, almost as though they're cutting across the page, and we can even see here that the page is literally bisected by a series of rapid-fire actions that are effectively showcased through a series of small, tight panels. So we've figured out how we can use the panels on the page to convey movement, but how about conveying movement within the panels? Here are some well-established bits of visual shorthand artists use to convey that an object or entity is in motion. And don't worry about taking all this in right now. We'll be going into each one of these. Action lines or motion blur are great for showing that something is currently in motion, as well as provide a sense of the direction of said motion. Adding additional figures helps to show the progression of movement. This is especially useful for complex actions like a flip or acrobatics that can't be conveyed simply with showcasing a single still image. Smear frames or exaggerated gestures are also great for conveying fluid action. Obviously, human arms and legs don't bend the way they're depicted here, but exaggerating the poses with these fluid shapes really amps up the motion and impact in these panels. I'd also like to draw your attention to how even the particle effects in these panels help to illustrate the direction and the force of the hit. Details like this go a long way towards making your visuals punchy and high impact. And speaking of gut punches, another element of visual storytelling that helps to keep things high impact is making your characters look expressive. There's no need to add more text saying that a character is sad when the reader can tell the character is sad just by looking at their face or body language. Now, there are a million different ways to showcase emotion in your characters, regardless of what art style you prefer to work with. But regardless of how cartoony or realistic your style is, remember that emotions are most prominently conveyed through the eyes and eyebrows, or the mouth. And, as always, the most important resource to consult when drawing expressions is the mirror. Making the face you're drawing as you're drawing it might make you look crazy, but it will also help you to visualize what muscles are being squished and stretched so you can easily figure out what needs to be exaggerated or emphasized in your own drawing. Expressions really help to convey a character's mood without needing to spell it out in words. These characters' facial expressions tells you a lot about their mood without any additional text or explanation needed. And don't forget the power of body language in conveying emotion. You don't need a close-up shot of a character's face to show how they're feeling. You can just convey it through their posture and their stance. The general rule of thumb is that happiness and confidence are usually conveyed through open, wider stances, whereas sadness, fear, or anxiety are conveyed through shrinking, closed-off poses. Body language is especially useful for conveying emotion when you aren't able to or want to include a tight shot of a character's face. Excuse me. So we've covered how to use shape and layout of panels and the movement and emotion of the characters within said panels to signal information to the reader, but we can do even more by making the setting itself tell the reader a story without more exposition. Let's start by looking at this panel, devoid of any context. What conclusions can you draw about this character based on his apartment? I'll give you a moment to drink this in before I move on, and also take a drink myself. All right. So, firstly, we can immediately notice how messy this place is. Look at the moldy bread, the unwashed dishes, and the spilled cans of beer. This room has lots of clutter, and even if you disregard the mess, it looks pretty modest. And on closer inspection, you might also spot some occult objects in here. This guy is clearly interested in or involved with the paranormal, in case the little demon floating next to him doesn't immediately make that clear. To contrast, let's look at the environment depicted in these two panels. What sort of conclusions can you draw about the character whose office this is with just the environment alone? Again, I'll give you a minute and then I'll move on. Okay, so immediately we notice the relief statue hanging on the wall and that this office occupies the penthouse suite with a view of the city skyline. There's also pristine, minimalist furniture that looks clinical and expensive. This guy's desk is also clean and free of clutter, much like the rest of his office. And there's a liquor cabinet with a fancy decanter and a set of glasses. So this character is clearly someone very high up in the corporate food chain to have such an expensive office, perhaps the type who makes, deals with important players, as the liquor cabinet suggests that there might be some boozing and schmoozing taking place in this very room. And seeing these two environments side by side really helps to drive home the difference between these two characters. These two people, who they are, what they do, how they live, these things are all extremely clear without a word of exposition or explanation needed. Yeah, that was a lot of information for you to absorb. So once again, to really help drive these topics home, let's review what we just covered by doing a deep dive into a single comic that does a lot of showing and not telling. Here's a page from issue number 1 of the all-new Ghost Rider. What sort of conclusions can you draw about these characters given no other context? I'll give you a minute and then we'll start digging in. Okay, so the first thing that I notice is that the guy in blue is taking care of the kid in yellow. The older one in blue looks like he's recently gotten into a fight, given that he has a black eye, a swollen lip, and a bandaged nose. But whatever incident took place is clearly behind him, since these two characters look at ease and happy in this moment. We can also see from the limited dialogue and their surroundings that these two characters live in a shady neighborhood with aspirations of getting out. That's a lot of story with not a lot of exposition. but let's do a deeper dive into the 4 elements of visual storytelling we just discussed to see how they've been employed here to give us so much information at a glance. Starting with the big picture, we can see how the panels here easily guide the viewer's eye across and down the page, but that the camera, so to speak, lingers longest on this panel with the 2 characters enjoying their meal and prominently showcases their expressions and body language. Zooming in, we can see how the shape of the steam from the bowl that the older guy in the blue shirt, we can see that the steam coming from the bowl shows that the older guy in the blue shirt has just come in from the kitchen, having prepared a meal for them to share. And we can also see how the kid in yellow is excitedly gobbling up his dinner, which we can see gestured through this exaggerated bend of his arm holding the fork. We can also immediately infer a lot about these 2 characters' relationship based on their expressions alone. The younger one is clearly happy and excited about his dinner, and the older one looks on fondly. Based on their expressions, we can tell that these characters are clearly comfortable with each other and that the older one cares deeply for the younger one, and by which we can probably assume that they're family, maybe siblings, based on their ages. We can also see how the character's mood and personality is further expressed through their body language. The younger one's exuberance is being demonstrated with this big arm motion, and the older one looks much more reserved with a more static and closed off pose, even though both these people are doing the same thing, which is eating a bowl of mac and cheese. With these details alone, the visuals signal to the audience that one of these characters is more carefree and the other is more responsible. Now, let's zoom back out a bit and look at these characters' surroundings. The house looks tidy and lived in, but modest, and even in this panel that only showcases the characters, we can see that the walls are a little dingy. So from these upper panels, we can maybe infer that these characters aren't very well off, and the lower panels confirm that they live in a shady neighborhood and that they want to leave. So that brings us to the end of part 2. Hopefully we've established some easy ways for you to use the visuals in your comic to provide more context and more information to your reader without overwhelming them with written exposition. Remember, use the power of implication and visual cues to your advantage. Your audience will be able to figure things out for themselves with the visual clues you provide them. So that was a lot of talking. So I thought we'd cap off this session with a bit of a live demonstration. I'll be switching from Keynote into Clip Studio Paint, where I'll walk you through my process for thumbnailing a comic page. And hopefully when I switch programs, this whole thing doesn't come crashing down on me. Bear with me a moment. All right, so, I'm so sorry. Every comic page that I start with, I usually start with the dialogue. This gives me the clearest idea of what I want to convey in a page. So here I've already laid this out. Here's a set of sort of stage directions and dialogue that I have planned out to go on this specific comic page. The first thing I generally do when I look at these dialogue snippets is I try and establish what needs to be grouped into a single panel, and sort of I try and in my mind's eye picture what sort of layout I want to have. So let's go in here with a pen and start marking things up. So we have some stage directions here that shows a panel of Octavia walking through the corridors of this building, and then we have a flashback sequence. And so I think my thought was that we would have these two, this bit of back and forth in a single panel. This I want to be high impact, so I'll keep this separate as well. And then maybe split this up into 2 panels. So keep the Psy in one panel and the rest in a second. So we'll do panel 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then maybe a 6th panel showing maybe a 6th panel of showing Octavia walking. So this was planned to be a 2-page spread, and because I want to pull the reader's eye from this corner of the page to this one, I want to start with having a panel in this upper corner. And so we can make that panel 1 showing sort of Octavia's face, a close-up of her very neutral expression, because I want to emphasize that she's masking her feelings here. So we can sort of have something there. And then I wanted to do a long lingering shot of this building. So I think, you know, here's a long hallway with some very rudimentary windows drawn in there. And we can also show panel 6 of this character walking, which means that my thinking for this is that in this flashback, it's going to be set in the same location, and it'll almost be as though this character, Octavia, is walking past some of her memories of this place. And so we'll do, let's mark this out in a different color, panel 2, which features Octavia and her older sister talking. We'll have the little kid here. And her sister here. And you'll notice I'm not trying to put any details in. I'm just trying to determine what the composition of this is going to be. The point of thumbnailing is not necessarily to add in any detail, but to just establish where everything goes. So here we have panel 1, 2, and then we'll do a tight shot of these 2 characters' faces, because I want to showcase that in this moment, Octavia is looking sad. And then we'll do a tight shot of her older sister looking stern or resigned. And then one final panel where it's the 2 of them interacting again. So that it provides you the context of these 2 characters having a back and forth interaction. So I realize this does not look like much. But now that we've established how we want these panels to be laid out, my hope is that by laying it out in this way, it pulls the reader's eye across the page in this manner. And now we can also take a look at the actual thumbnail I did for this page, which includes a little bit more detail. I, in this thumbnail, wanted to show how I was going to add more contrast to the page, which is why I added these gradients. Because it's all about making things stand out by having them contrast against each other, I thought that the best way to do that was by putting these sort of let me make a new layer, by putting these sort of contemporary present day panels being set in these, being sort of shadowed, and then these panels being lighter in the flashback. And we can also see how once we're done, you know, not to take things from step 0 to almost finished, but here's the sketch for this panel, where once you get to the sketching stage, you can kind of start drilling down into how you want these characters' emotions to look. I know some people do very loose sketches. I wish I could do that. I cannot. I generally prefer to make my sketches pretty detailed so that when I go in and ink everything in, I don't have to make anything up as I go. And so you can see here, I've tried really hard to make the emotions very prominent in these tight shots, and also showcase the setting very prominently. And then here's the finished result. Once again, just, you know, pointing things out, we have the speech bubbles here that I've used to try and guide the reader's eye in this manner. Generally speaking, people tend to follow. I try to let the speech bubbles guide the reader from left to right, up to down, but I also try and make them occupy blank spaces in the page, so that it naturally flows. But yeah, you can also see here how I've tried to employ color to signal to the reader what is happening in the flashback versus what is happening in the present. The stuff that's happening present day is depicted in purple, as you can see. And then the stuff that's happening in the flashback, you know what, let me circle this in a different color. The stuff that's happening in a flashback is sort of colored out in blue as opposed to purple. All right, I think that brings me to the end of my talk. I'm happy to move on to a Q&A session if people are so inclined. Hopefully I sort of did a decent overview of what I try to keep in mind to make my comics easy to read and follow, and therefore more engaging to read. But again, if you have any questions about my process, feel free to ask them now. Mario?
Yes.
Are there any questions for me to answer?
There's a lot of questions, but also a lot of great comments. I'm sorry, I was just checking them.
Oh, no, take your time.
But thank you so much for this amazing masterclass. There's people from all over the world watching us. For example, Aleta from South Africa, David from Great Britain, Macedonia, Tamara. There's people from the US and Canada, like Imre, Ireland, Robson, Hungary,
Wow.
Anastasia. Let me see other place.
Hi, everybody.
Mexico, Philippines, Janika. Thank all of you who are joining us live. I'm gonna share some nice comments. For example, Andres says, "Hi Jackie, not a question, but just to say the webinar is awesome. Thank you."
Well, thank you so much.
Jackie's experience really shows such a fun, useful presentation. Brilliant. Nick is saying, Jackie, it is absolutely amazing. I appreciate you taking your time to provide this webinar. I learned a lot thanks to your easy to understand and follow presentation. I love your work. So yeah, a lot of love. Thank all of you. And let's start with some questions.
Yes.
Anna says, what would you consider the best way to learn perspective?
What would I consider the best way to learn perspective? I mean, there's a lot of, I am trying to remember off the top of my head. There are a bunch of books you can read. I think there's like, one of them is called like A Beginner's Guide to Perspective. You know what? I will be sending to Mario a list of the sources I've consulted for this. I'm so sorry, excuse me. I will be sending to Mario a list of these sources I've used in my talk, and I'll also include some resources if I mention them in this Q&A session. But there are a couple books you can read, but realistically, the best way to get better at perspective is to just keep drawing it, which always stinks, because it is challenging to practice something that you are very unpracticed at, right? But it's really the only way to get better. This is a piece of advice I need to take for myself. But also, I have discovered that the best way to instantly improve at any specific element of your art is to find what it is about drawing it that makes you happy, and therefore make drawing it fun. So when I was, for example, learning to draw hands, the way I got much better at it was simply by realizing, hey, I really like adding in the details of fingernails. And I also like drawing the seam that goes down the side of a glove. And so I was like, oh, suddenly drawing hands is fun, which suddenly makes me draw a lot more of them, which always makes you get better. So that wasn't necessarily the most informative response, but hopefully that's helpful.
For sure. Let's go with a question from Aleta. I'm bad at reading expression and emotion from facial cues. Do you have any media sources you can recommend to help to get an idea of what to do?
Yeah, again, I'll see what I can pull up for, there are a million tutorials floating around online for how to do good expressions. But the best resource, again, that I can convey to you is, one, use a mirror, and two, this is less of a tip for expressions and more a tip generally, any piece of media that you consume that you really like, I would recommend doing a deep dive. Like, if you love it, it shouldn't be a problem to rewatch it or reread it again anyway, right? Because it's fun, it's engaging for you to watch. Watch it again, but this time with a more critical eye of, what about this makes it appeal to me, and how is it doing it so well? So, for example, when you're looking at a comic or a show where the characters are really expressive, I would sort of rewatch it with a more analytical lens and try and figure out, what about the way these characters are drawn, the way they're animated, how does that make them very expressive, and then try and incorporate whatever you discover from that into your own workflow. And then also, again, cannot overemphasize, mirror. Use a mirror. Mirrors are great. Make the face, make an angry face. Think about how your face sits when you're angry. Make that face into a mirror and then draw that face. You might look crazy, but it does work really well.
For sure. And there's another question. What's your favorite tool or feature of Clip Studio Paint when making panels for your webtoons?
My very favorite tool that I will never shut up about, specifically for paneling, is the built-in paneling tools in Clip Studio. I think I have, not to sound like a evangelist, but Clip Studio's built-in paneling tools are so useful and time-saving. So the ones that I have on hand, I'll just do a live demo here. So we have over here the create frame tool. There's the rectangular frame, there's the polyline frame, and there's the frame border pen. I primarily use the rectangle frame because most of my panels are regular rectangles. But okay, so you just have it instantly makes just a panel in whatever size you want, and it automatically sort of groups it up into its own layer group, which means that you can sort of let's say you want to draw something here, but you don't want to go past the lines, it automatically turns that into a mask for you. It's so handy. But in addition to that, you also get this tool, which is the cut frame border. Now, there are two versions of this. One, which creates two different layer groups for these two new panels, and one that keeps everything in the same layer group. So this is all still one layer group. This is easily one of the most useful tools in Clip Studio. Love using it in my workflow. Very, very handy.
Well, thank you. And here's another question. Well, there are a lot of questions about color, but I will read Ambrin's. How do you think of your colors for the panel?
The way I think of colors for my own panels, it's funny. I actually am someone who's actually much more comfortable working in black and white. But one tool I often use in my own workflow is let me pull it up, is the gradient map tool. And this is not a particularly good layer to showcase that, but let's take this layer again and let's change it to black and white. So we'll, oh goodness, wrong layer. We'll do a tonal correction and turn down the saturation, which makes this grayscale. By getting a gradient map, you can adjust the color as you see fit. This is really useful if you, like me, prefer to work in black and white or grayscale and sort of work in values. It allows you to sort of add color to the page. You can also mask it if you want. So for example, here's the mask. You can erase parts of it. This is not the best brush for that. But you can erase parts of the gradient map and add others. But yeah, gradient maps are great for thinking about color. Generally speaking, when I think about color, I try to think about what is complementary and what is complementary and what will add the most contrast. So, complementary colors are colors opposite to each other on the color wheel: red and green, blue and orange, purple and yellow, that sort of thing. So yeah, I don't know if that's an adequate answer to your question, but that's kind of how I go about things.
No, for sure. And also, there's a few questions about your speech bubbles. Do you create it manually or do you use a tool from Clip Studio?
Yes, so I do both. It depends a little bit. Clip Studio does have a really handy tool for making speech bubbles. Let me try and find where it is. I think I have it mapped to the T button on my keyboard. But you can see here, this is an easy way to make a speech bubble. There's the rounded balloon tool. You can just go ahead and add text to it. Actually, I usually do the reverse where I add text. Oh my goodness. Why is this not working? I'm so sorry. There is a, my pet rabbit is upset with me that I'm not paying attention to her. Here we go. All right, so let's say here is some text. You can then make a speech bubble around it. And that's very low contrast. I should have picked a different color for the text. But then you can also add, using the balloon tail tool, let's make that a little wider. There we go. You can make a balloon tail. And then also another handy feature in Clip Studio is the ability to set a line to go around whatever layer you're working on. So you can see here, I've outlined this layer by using this effect in the layer properties menu of turning on a border. So here, there's a 5-pixel wide border surrounding the text bubble. You can turn it off and on as you see fit. So in my comic Ladykillers, I just use the balloon tool. For KISMET, what I often do is I hand draw the speech bubbles, and then I will, for example, let's take this again. We're gonna make a copy of it and then rasterize the layer, alpha lock, fill it with black, move it under the original layer, un-alpha lock, and then do a Gaussian blur to create sort of a drop shadow. I'm sorry, this is... Hold on. There we go. So you can see here, this is basically what I've done for the KISMET speech bubbles, which is I create a new layer, fuzz it out, make it into a drop shadow. But yeah, that's how I make speech bubbles. It's really up to you. Sometimes I prefer the hand-drawn look. Sometimes I prefer the just the ease of using the balloon tool, but it's case-by-case basis. If that makes any sense.
For sure. And another question is, how do you know how many panels to use in a scene?
That's a really great question. It really depends, right? So when you're looking at the script for any particular scene, the thing you want to establish is, one, what feels like a natural break in the dialogue for someone to turn the page or to keep scrolling onward. And two, what do you want to convey in this page and what's important? So for example, in this script, what I wanted to convey are the characters' emotions. And I also wanted to really make this a set piece for showcasing the environment. And so my thought when putting this together is I don't want to clutter up the page with too many panels. I want to keep it minimal so that we can see the big backdrop in the background. But again, as we've seen in the presentation, let's go to the navigator and pull up one of the previous slides. It is here. In this slide, you can see there are tons of panels being utilized here, but it doesn't, like, the clutter is the point, right? It feels claustrophobic because it's showcasing a lot of rapid fire action happening all at once. So there's no right or wrong answer to how do you know how many panels you want to show on a page. It's really entirely dependent on what you want to show, and also it's important to keep in mind how you want to pace it, if that makes any sense. So again, we see tons of panels being used to sort of showcase lots of quick rapid fire action, but also we'll go back to this comic page, there are a lot fewer panels because it's a slower scene and it's less focused on the action and more focused on whatever is happening on these characters' faces.
And another question is, what's the most difficult panel that you have had to create so far in any of your webtoons?
Oh man, that's a good question. Certainly this is one of them. There are a couple other examples I could pull up. Certainly, I think any panel that requires me to work a lot on backgrounds is challenging for me, because the thing I like to draw most are the characters. But I think also this one was difficult in that I needed to be very cognizant about how I was using the values within it to keep things prominent. So I wanted to keep excuse me, here we go. I wanted to keep Octavia prominent in this sort of in the front, but I also needed everything to sort of be shadowed a little bit. And when you're already having a kind of dark background with a kind of dark character, that can be very tricky to do. So I would say this is probably one of the more difficult panels I've worked on. There's just a lot going on in it, but it was also a ton of fun to work on. this is a total aside, but if you want to see a visual masterclass in using contrast to showcase like a dark character standing in a dark background, watch the 4th John Wick movie. The people in charge of cinematography really know what they're doing there, because John Wick is dressed in all black with black hair, and he's always like shooting people in a dark room. And so seeing the way the director and the cinematographer set up all those scenes and set up all those shots so that there's enough light and contrast to show what's even happening on the screen is a real treat.
And I'm gonna summarize a question from JJ Humphrey. If before going into on the design itself of the characters, the panels, do you create some assets already, like brushes, textures for backgrounds, or details of the story that you will use graphically or visually on the production?
Yeah. So it depends, right? I feel like the name of the game in comics is always, will this actually save me time? Because in this particular line of work, it's all about how can I draw all the things in the least amount of time. And so, I don't often spend my time building like a set. I know lots of people like to build a set for their comic, like in Blender, or I've seen people even do it in like The Sims. I don't always do that because I, at present, have not had a set that recurs often enough that I feel it justifies the amount of time I spend like modeling it and then like, capturing it on the either in-game or in program camera, so that I can trace over it. Same with brushes. Brushes are a lot more, I obviously care a lot more about them in my own workflow. And so I've customized a whole bunch to sort of fit my own preferences and needs. It's really unfortunate. Oftentimes people will ask me, what brush do you use? And I will say, like, I use the brush from, currently I've been really enjoying the Lucas Painador brushes, as well as have loved Frendon's brush sets for Clip Studio for years and years. But I've also like tweaked all of the brushes that I use regularly specifically to my own preferences. And because these are part of paid brush sets, I am not comfortable releasing these brushes with my personal tweaks to them because I didn't make these brushes. That wouldn't be fair to their creators. But it's also like, brushes are so personal. And so a lot of the ones that I have made for my own workflow are like, would these even work for somebody else? I don't know. But generally speaking, I tend to draw most of my work from scratch, mostly because I spend more time trying to pose a 3D model than I would just sketching something out. But it's really all about what works for your own workflow. There's no right or wrong answer. It's all about how can you do something the most efficiently. And this is what works for me, but that doesn't necessarily mean it won't work for you.
And one question from Jen: how different is the paneling process for a Webtoon format versus a traditional page?
Oh, this is a great question. Yeah, so the paneling process for traditional comics, like page by page comics versus Webtoon, I would say is pretty different in that Webtoon format to me has always felt a little bit more intuitive in that you are not constrained by a page, right? You aren't constrained by how much you can fit on a single page. And that means you're given a lot more freedom to do, like, I love doing tight shots of a character's face, both because that's very fun to draw and also because it's a great way to really highlight emotionally what's going on. So Webtoon gives you a lot more freedom for you to play with adding, like, for example, you script out a scene, you thumbnail it, and then you realize, I want to add another panel here. With the Webtoon format, you can easily do that. Like you can just sort of be like, all right, I can insert another panel in between these two panels and it's not a problem. That's a lot harder to do with the sort of page by page comic format, where if I needed to add another panel to this, I would have to move everything around to make room for it. So I would say, for me personally, it feels pretty different, but fundamentally, it's still all about using the contents of the visuals you have on the page, on the screen, to guide the reader's eye. And so for Webtoon, the idea is not to get your reader to move from left to right necessarily. It's all about getting them to keep scrolling downwards. And so you get a lot more of these vertical transitions that are, I mean, they're really cool. I always love seeing the way people do these sort of seamless transitions from scene to scene. But with page format comics, you can get some really cool effects where I've seen certain comics. I cannot recall off the top of my head which issue this was, but there's one of the issues of Chainsaw Man where they do a jump scare by making you turn a page, and the page turn itself it contains the surprise, right? You don't know what's happening on the next page until you turn the page, and then you get that jump scare. And so there are differences to each medium, and it's all about figuring out how to make whatever visuals you're putting on the page or screen guide your reader to whatever destination they want to go to, whether it's left to right or top to bottom.
Awesome. And also, well, before going to the last question, thank all of you who share your Instagram stories and tag Jaki and us. We are sharing all of your stories on the Graphicsly profile. And one last question is actually if you could share a suggestion, a word for anybody who is still struggling transferring from their scripts to visual storytelling their comics.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it depends what sort of advice you want. I would say that it's whenever I'm moving from looking at my scripts to trying to actually put to a page what the scripts are trying to show, I am trying to think in my head, what am I trying to convey? What's the most important thing about the scene? What's the point of the scene? I tend to try and let I tend to prefer a less is more approach, where I don't love to include tons and tons of exposition on my page. I just generally, my own personal preference is I don't like reading that, and so I assume other people won't either. And so I try to make the things I include on the page a bit more deliberate so that I can avoid that. But where am I going with this? Yeah, I think the most important thing to remember for me has always been draw for the audience that you want, and don't bother trying to cater to the lowest common denominator, if that makes any sense. I, for a long time, struggled with, how much information do I include in this page? I really want to convey to the reader what's happening. And my editor for KISMET at the time basically said, you want to select for readers that will get it when you breadcrumb the story to them anyway. So write for those readers. Don't bother trying to explain it to someone who isn't willing to think about it and get it. And so I really took that advice to heart. That was really, really good advice. And so when moving from script to a comic page, I'm just always thinking, what's going to look good and what am I trying to show here? And then really just being mindful of that as I work on the visuals.
So with those wise words, unfortunately we're finishing, but we really enjoyed your webinar, Jackie. It's been a
Thank you.
master class, and everybody loved it. There's so much love to you on the question panel, so
Thank
thank you
you
so
so much,
much.
everybody.
But before we go, we just want to share one last bit of information. Um, Learn more about Clip Studio Paint. Visit our website clipstudio.net/n or graphicsly.com for more details about the software. And also subscribe to our YouTube channels, Clip Studio Paint channel and Graphicsly, to get a notification once the recording of this session is available to watch. But also check Graphicsly playlist with all the webinars we have done so far. You will find other webinars also about webtoons and other topics that you will find so interesting, that you will incorporate to your own workflow. And please follow Jackie, her amazing work on her socials. Hey, it's Jackie on Instagram, Twitter or X, Tumblr, Jackie Draws on Twitch and TikTok, and her website, designedbyjackie.com. So with that, thank you so much, Jackie.
Thank you, Mario. And thank everybody for coming and attending. This is so fun.
Thank all of you who joined us live. So please stay tuned for more webinars, information, tutorials, etc. about Clip Studio Paint in our social media, Graphicsly and Clip Studio Official. So thank all of you. We hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.